Good day and welcome back to the Ottawa History Hub podcast. We've been talking about urban issues of late, walking around the early town, and talking about the religious predilections of its residents. Today, we're going to be returning to the traditional economy that surrounded the colony. Now, unlike Europe in the 1830s, or the Caribbean colonies, or even coastal American colonies, the Ottawa Valley was not an agrarian enterprise. There were certainly farmers, but for the most part, outside of the settlements of Bytown and Wrightstown in our narrative, or a handful of other settlements up the river, the valley of the Grand River that divided Upper and Lower Canada was a wilderness. It was inhabited by sparse communities of Algonquin and a few dozen European settler families. The largest economic adventure was the lumber trade, and if you'd like a reminder of that, then please give episode 17, The Timber Town, a re-listen. There were other economic activities at play, in addition to the farming and lumberjackery. The most common was a business that we started with last year in episode 3 of season 1, when Etienne Brulé first rode up the river with his new friends. That industry was the fur trade. Fur was no longer as profitable as it had once been, but it was still big money. And it still is today, if you've ever tried to price a real fur coat. While beaver was still highly prized, it was no longer so abundant that it could be harvested with ease. Marten and fisher, mink and lynx, as well as otter and sable, all had very warm and valuable fur that would be a great value added to supplement the income of our farmers and traders along the riverlands. During the height of the French fur trade, the functional model was that a handful of voyageurs and coureurs de bois would travel deep into the interior and buy furs from Indigenous people who would trap the animals, skin them, and prepare the furs. Sometimes the French would establish small trading posts deep in the interior where the Indigenous hunters could bring their wares, and the voyageurs would sail to those trading posts and return to Montreal or Quebec with the goods. Since the time of Etienne Brulé, a lot had changed. There were now many trading posts across the Great Lakes, the Hudson Bay Basin, and the Ottawa River watershed. Hunters could move their goods to the nearest settlement, rather than make the annual trip all the way to the big city. The other major change was the monopoly of the Hudson Bay Company, based in London. The company was founded in 1670 and controlled the British side of the fur trade in Rupert's Land, or the Hudson Bay area. They established trading posts to facilitate trade with the Cree, the Innu, and the other nations of the area. They stayed in the north, and the French stayed in the Great Lakes area, reasonably amicably until the fall of New France in the 1760s. And then their monopoly became uncontested in the lands under the British Crown across North America. The HBC, the Hudson Bay Company, was presented with an option of creating a stable economic system that would benefit all participants and use that stability to make many people wealthy, or option 2, to try and squeeze as much as possible for themselves and damn everyone else. There's an idiom that a cow gives milk for years or meat once. It means that if you manage your resources properly, you can have a long-term source of wealth, or you can go all in to maximize your profits in the short term. You lose that stability and source of wealth and need to move on to the next one, like a locust. The Hudson Bay Company wanted roast beef, not cheese. I know that there are many who bemoan the loss of the company, as though it was an element of our collective nationhood, and not just some company out there to make a profit. But I am not one of them. The monopoly of the HBC was oppressive to their employees, suppliers, and clients, also merchants in Montreal, who had access to the rivers inland, as well as access to disgruntled Hudson Bay employees, founded the Northwest Company in 1779. They would compete with the London-based Hudson Bay Company across the British domains of North America, up to the Red River area of modern Manitoba, and would also trade throughout the American-claimed Indian Territory as well. The Northwest Company was not an arm of the British government or Canadian. They were simply a company engaging in commerce. One of the fundamental differences between the Northwest and the Hudson Bay Companies was that the Northwest didn't have a monopoly to protect, and so were happy to trade with whoever had furs to sell them, and would sell their wares not only in London, but to anyone who wanted to buy them. Resource competition between the two companies turned into a military conflict called the Pemmican War in 1816 to 1821, at the end of which the two companies were forcibly merged. Neither company flourished in the Ottawa Valley because of Filman Wright's control of the bottleneck at Chaudière Falls. Both tried to establish trading posts in Wrightstown, but were denied by the old squire, and any commerce passing through his domain would have to pay tribute. When English settlers began to facilitate trade on the South Shore after 1815, the Northwest Company was able to establish itself as a stronger presence further up the river, avoiding the Wrightstown bottleneck. The Northwest Company established trading posts in Maniwaki and Buckingham and established a circuit to bring furs to Montreal. Generally speaking, the canoes, filled with mixed trade goods, would head up the river from Montreal, pay the toll for transporting those less valued goods at Chaudière, and then continue up the Ottawa River west, then north, eventually to Temiskaming shores. Trading along the way, as they did, their loads got lighter, because copperware and other trade goods were typically heavier than furs. From Temiskaming, they would then cut back east across to what's now Grand Lac Victoria, then south along the route now occupied by Highway 117, back to Montreal with their furs to put to market. While the Hudson Bay Company was peopled largely by Englishmen and Scotsmen, definitely men, not many women were involved in this venture, the Northwest Company hired more locally, with their voyageurs, interpreters, guides, and other engagés recruited mostly from Lower Canada, and including a large population of the children of mixed marriages between Scottish or French fur traders and their Indigenous partners. These métis would typify the workers and local agents of the Northwest Company across the Ottawa Circuit, the Great Lakes, and even into the Red River settlement out west. This brings us to the Rideau Canal project, and particularly the establishment of Bytown as a depot for its construction. John By hired several Indigenous hands as canoemen on the canal. They would courier messages from Bytown to Kingston, keeping communication and bringing intelligence from the other end of the project. Additionally, they could speak to any Algonquin bands that the canal might encounter as the trench was dug through their traditional land. The canal would not be ready for large steamers until 1932, so the fleet canoes were the best tool until then. In 1828, By wrote to the HBC office in Lachine, thanking them for sending several canoes and interpreters to assist in the project. Because of Bytown's role as a depot and lumber hub, it would act as a hub and depot for the fur trade as well because of its pre-existing warehouses. Indigenous petty fur traders would come to town in the spring, trade furs, and then seek work as canoemen and canoe makers, accompanying the timbermen up to their lumber camps, and then continue along back to their summer territories, where they would remain hunting and preparing for winter, only to repeat the process again in the springtime. During the construction of the canal, there wouldn't have been any very serious effects on the fur trade, but after the waterway was completed in 1832, a whole new opportunity developed for the trade. Americans were no longer menacing the British settlement of Upper Canada, and just as merchants from the NWC were traveling about lands claimed by Washington, American fur traders began poking around in the lands claimed by London. The Rideau Canal connected the Ottawa River to the St. Laurent as a trade route. With the demilitarization of the Great Lakes that was officially proclaimed by the 1817 Rush-Bagot Agreement, English traders would come up from New York State along the canal to find Bytown, a great depot which would be supplied from Montreal, but for which the Hudson Bay Company's monopoly of the fur trade could not be enforced in this wild frontier land. Many local traders had already set up in the town, specifically in the area of Sussex and George Street, near the British Hotel. American traders would come up to Bytown with very little that would accrue tariff or import tax, supply an outfit in Bytown, and then head upriver to trade and collect furs. They would then head down the canal to Kingston and cross over at Sackett's Harbor into New York State, avoiding Montreal and the threat of local customs agents trying to protect the Hudson Bay Company influence. Something that distinguished the American traders from their HBC competitors was in what they traded. HBC would bring along various trade goods, including metalware, foodstuffs, and tobacco. The Yankees would bring cash and booze. The long and sordid history of selling vice to keep a population docile is a shame on those who perpetrated it. From the opium wars of that same period to flooding the American black community with cheap cocaine in the 1980s, cheap intoxicants is never a good long-term deal for the buyer. The HBC had been trading alcohol to Indigenous fur suppliers as policy since 1740 and continued to do so until they sold their spirits division to Seagram's in 1987. That being said, they were held back, not by some sense of vestigial morality, but because of public pressure by religious groups in England. So they sold less in the Bytown-Temiskaming Grand Victoria Loop, but away from the prying press in places like Manitoba. Every trading post would also have a distillery. The American traders were not government agents, and not operating in U.S. territory, and were not subject to the same scrutiny. So they were free to trade with the suppliers as fur for alcohol and U.S. dollars, which could theoretically be traded for anything anywhere, including more alcohol, which sometimes happened. This helped Bytown to transform in the 1830s from a labor camp in 1826 to a hub for river trade for lumber and furs. It was competing with the more established markets in Wrightstown, but whereas the Lower Canada settlement was under the firm grip of Filmon and his sons, the Upper Canada settlement on the South Shore was a wide-open market, without police, a courthouse, or even a local gentry trying to whet its beak. This turned Bytown into a magnet for the petty fur trade, and those not wanting to deal directly with the HBC monopoly. One of the first such independent fur traders was a Scotsman by the name of Robert McGregor, who settled just past the village of Perkins, Quebec, on what's now called McGregor Lake. McGregor married a Saulteaux woman from Oka named Marie Riel, a name that will pop up again amongst Métis people. He was a registered fur trader in Buckingham, Sault Ste. Marie, Cumberland, and a dozen other Northwest Company trading posts, attesting to the capacity for locals to travel at this time. Many of the Indigenous, or even partially Indigenous people involved in the fur trade began to focus more of their efforts on the open possibilities of Bytown, rather than the more regulated business that took place in the HBC Dominion. This began to marginalize the trade in HBC strongholds, like Lac des Sables, on the upper Lèvres River, towards the end of the traditional Bytown-Temiskaming Lake Victoria circuit. Thomas Taylor, an HBC clerk in Lac des Sables, described the situation to his superiors in Montreal thusly in 1845. "I am sorry to inform you that we are surrounded here this season by rival traders, William Dunning and a man by the name of Joseph Foubert, a farmer in this region, in this river below us, and are our strongest opponents, besides some others who gather up as much furs as they can for the Bytown market. This confounded Bytown is the ruin of the trade of this place. Nothing can be done here of any consequence now without cash. To attain furs at all, we need cash. We must also give the prices our opponents give them." The centre of ruin in Bytown was the intersection of Sussex and George Street, across from the modern-day Connaught Building. There you'd find most of the fur traders' offices, including that of Chauncey Bangs, not the figure skater, but the future 12th mayor of Ottawa. And you could also cross Sappers Bridge to Wellington Street to find the fur trading office of Edward McGilvery, the future 2nd mayor of Ottawa. While the fur trade was not as lucrative as it had once been, and was not as important to the development of Bytown as the construction of the Rideau Canal or the timber trade, it was still an important part of the economic diversity needed for any long-term community. While there were some people who were full-time fur traders, for most of those involved in the trade, their involvement was part-time or seasonal augmentations to their major work in farming, trading, or lumber. Fur, like lumber, was manna from the forest that surrounded the settlements. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Ottawa History Hub podcast. If you're enjoying the podcast, please subscribe on whichever podcatcher you're using, and leave a rating or comment. This show is written, recorded, and produced by myself, Brendan Ray, and if you have any questions or comments for me directly, then my email is ottawahistoryhub@gmail.com. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, or Blue Sky, and check out the website at ottawahistoryhub.com. Next week, we'll be looking at the life and times of another one of Bytown's earliest settlers, Nicholas Sparks, who lived, somewhat predictably, near Sparks Street. Until then, advance Ottawa, en avant!